I am Kyle Westerman, and this is EDL 851, Supervision and Evaluation of School Personnel, and this is my case study on a good teacher turns bad, stress at home causes problems at school. When looking at the case, we're identifying the problems and analyzing it. So what do I know? First, Mrs. Horton's attitude had changed towards staff and students after her husband had left, and we found this out after spring break of 1 year. We also know that as the new year started, after the summer had gone and we started a new year, they started a new reading program, and Mrs. Horton disagreed with that. They're also getting complaints that Mrs. Horton is yelling, berating, and embarrassing her students in class. And finally, both the superintendent and school board members have received calls about Mrs. Horton's behavior and wants their kids out of her classroom. What do I need to know? So things that we need to know that we don't know from reading the case study. First, what protocol does the district have for disciplining a teacher for misbehaving and causing problems? Second, what strategies can be used to remedy this situation? So what does the school have in place to help fix this problem? Third, can the district recommend counseling? So if Mrs. Horton is having problems at home and she's taking it out on her students, can the school say, hey, we need to get you some help and in the form of counseling? And finally, did Mrs. Horton receive any emotional assistance during the summer break? We know from reading the case study that the principal didn't do anything at the end of the school year when her attitude had changed. She'd hoped that the summer would make it better, but it didn't. And so we don't know if Mrs. Horton had received any emotional assistance during the summer break to help fix her family problems. Category 2, the proposed plan of action with appropriate strategies for implementation. So the plan that we had come up with in reading this case study is we need to have a conference with Mrs. Horton and the superintendent as the administrator to talk about what's going on in her classroom. Secondly, we needed to develop an improvement plan. In this improvement plan, we could set out several different things of improvement. Of maybe it is counseling, maybe it's some time off, maybe we're talking about setting up a specific plan of if things don't change, we're going to lead down a path of possible termination, and that's our final step. Is if the teacher continues to yell and berate and embarrass her students. The third and final step is if she doesn't improve in the classroom, then it could be possible termination for that teacher. And resolving the issues based on promoting the success of all students. As teachers and administrators, our responsibility is to do what's best for the students. We need to promote academic success and personal well-being of every student. And how to do this is we're going to conference with the principal and superintendent. It could reveal to Mrs. Horton her issues in the classroom, and she seeks help on her own. So maybe that conference between the principal, superintendent, Mrs. Horton will open up her eyes to how she's acting in the classroom and how she's treating her students. And maybe just that awareness will help her change in the classroom. Secondly, the improvement plan could outline to Mrs. Horton the way she needs to improve emotionally, and she also needs to learn how to rebuild that trust with her students. That is huge in student success, is the trust between a student and a teacher. And Mrs. Horton has broken that trust. And so a lot of her students aren't going to learn because either they're too afraid to go to school, like in the case study that we read, or they don't feel like they can ask her questions because she's been embarrassing them, or they just don't they feel out of touch with her, and so they don't want to be there and they don't want to learn, and so they just space out and don't participate at all. And we also need to manage her classroom etiquette as well. And lastly, if her improvement or if her behavior does not change and it does not improve the academic success and personal well-being of each student, we need to talk about Mrs. Horton being removed as a teacher. Even though she has been a good teacher in the past, she's been there a long time. She was formerly nominated as Teacher of the Year. We do need to talk about if she is emotionally disturbing the kids, then we need to figure out something that gets her out of the classroom. the resolution to the problem, and based on the facts from the case, we do know that Mrs. Horton has had several complaints from parents. When the principal does talk to her, her behavior does not change, and she also had an angry outburst towards a parent, calling him a liar, in a conference between the principal, the parent of a student, and Mrs. Horton herself. And so we know that her temper is very short, and so that is an issue that needs to be changed. The improvement plan needs to be made because her behavior in the classroom, even after a break, has been poor. Principal in this scenario thought that maybe a couple months off would improve her attitude towards other teachers and the students, but in this case it did not, and it seems to have gotten worse. And so that improvement plan needs to be put in place so that we're monitoring Mrs. Horton's behavior, and if her behavior does not change, and then in our final step here, she needs to be terminated if she does not follow the improvement plan. So what am I thinking, feeling, and valuing as I read through this case study? I'm thinking that Mrs. Horton's toxic atmosphere that she's created in the classroom is detrimental to her students, as I've mentioned before, and as I've mentioned in several of our our readings throughout this semester, is that as a principal, as an educational leader, I need to have a trust of my staff, and as a teacher, you need to have your students' trust. And the toxic atmosphere in Mrs. Horton's classroom has caused a distrust between her and her students, and that is a toxic atmosphere, and it does not promote learning. How am I feeling in this situation? A little helpless because Mrs. Horton is an accomplished teacher, as from the case study as we read. She'd been teaching for a long time. She was nominated for Teacher of the Year, and she'd been doing a great job up until her personal problems. And as an administrator, you're not always versed in counseling and how to communicate with people when it's something personal that has caused somebody to change their attitude completely around. And so it's hard to sit there and talk about terminating a teacher who has been so good for so long, and one thing such as her husband leaving has caused her to become a terrible teacher. And what am I valuing? Definitely student safety. That is our number one responsibility, I think, as administrators, as teachers, is to make sure our students are safe, but also we are to promote student academic success and personal well-being as well. And if Mrs. Horton continues to berate and tear down her students, none of that is being valued at that point in time by Mrs. Horton. So what issues are still unresolved or open to further investigation? Obviously, Mrs. Horton's personal life, we don't know the ins and outs. From what we read in the case study, it's all really conjecture because we're getting it from other staff members and not exactly sure what's going on in her personal life for sure. We don't know that if we put in an improvement plan, if that improvement plan will work, if Mrs. Horton would change and become a better teacher again from that, because she has had conflicts with the principal and again with parents in a conference. And so we don't know if calling her out would hinder the situation or help the situation. And then finally, what do we do with Mrs. Horton's current students? Obviously, she can't continue to act the way she is and have students in her classroom. And so we need to figure out, do we remove the students whose parents have complained and let them go to a different classroom? If we did that, what do we do with the students that are left where the parents haven't complained? Would that overload other teachers and not be good scenarios for them? Do we put in a co-teacher in with Mrs. Horton to try to monitor her behavior, and maybe that would help her remedy what she's been doing? Maybe that is a way to sit there and observe from an adult perspective of how Mrs. Horton is acting in classroom. And so we need to do a little bit more investigation to see what to do with those students. And then as an educational leader, how do I promote academic success of every student in enhancing instructional capacity? Um, so as a principal, we did meet with Mrs. Horton about her berating other teachers. When talking about the reading program, Mrs. Horton was kind of bullying other teachers because she didn't agree with the new reading program. We had met with her, and it did not help. We also had been visiting the classroom on a regular basis because of the complaints by parents. And as we visited the classroom, we did not witness how Mrs. Horton's behavior um, was bad, but we're still continuing to get complaints by parents. And then we also did have a conference with the teacher and a concerned parent that did not end well. So how did I promote the personal well-being of every student by enhancing instructional capacity? I had listened to the complaints of concerned parents, staff, the superintendent, as well as school board members, and I have talked to Mrs. Horton, and we did try to set up a conference again. I also did do regular visits to the classroom to see what Mrs. Horton was doing. Again, I did not witness any behavioral issues when I was there. And again, we did have a conference with the teacher and a concerned parent that again did not end well. And how do I enhance instructional capacity? First, the situation investigated. I did investigate the situation before removing students from Mrs. Horton's classroom to a different classroom. And I did not just take the word of a parent or a student and move them right away. And I investigated to see what exactly was going on. Again, we visited the classroom on a regular basis to see if we could witness any of that behavior from Mrs. Horton. And again, we did conference with the teacher and a concerned parent to see if we could remedy some of the situation. And it did not end well. This is my case study